Starting the recording. So thanks everybody for joining us today. I am thrilled to help introduce today's webinar focused on armor in San Juan County and introduce you to Tina Whitman of the Friends of San Juans. My name is Matt Lurie and I work for WDFW, where I am the part of the National Estuary Program Habitat Strategic Initiative Lead Team, or HSIL for short, supporting the Shoreline Armoring Implementation Strategy. A few quick housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is being recorded. We are also planning on having time for questions at the end of the presentation. We're keeping the chat private, but you can send questions for the speaker directly to me anytime during the presentation using the chat function. And you can also ask questions live by raising your hand when we get to that point. My great colleague, Elizabeth Spalding from the Habitat Strategic Initiative Lead Team will be on technical support for any Zoom needs you might have, and you can reach out to her in the chat if something comes up. So just to get rolling, as I mentioned, I work for the Habitat Strategic Initiative, which is an interagency team supporting the National Estuary Program co-led by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife and Washington Department of Natural Resources. Our focus is on advancing Puget Sound recovery through collaborative planning and strategic investments. We award grants with Puget Sound geographic funds through a cooperative agreement with EPA in support of the Puget Sound Action Agenda and implementation strategies. One of the reasons this is really exciting work is because these dollars go towards traditionally difficult to fund actions that catalyze greater opportunities for recovery. Tina's project was recommended by our advisory team for funding in 2019 in support of the Armoring Implementation Strategy and the 2018 to 2022 Puget Sound Action Agenda, and it represents a continuation of the longstanding investments of our program in promoting healthy shorelines. As many of you are aware, approximately 1/3 of Puget Sound is lined with bulkheads and hard structures. These armored shorelines often disrupt critical physical processes like sediment transport and have cascading negative ecological impacts on food webs and biodiversity. The Shoreline Armoring Implementation Strategy identifies regional paths to reduce ecosystem impacts of hard armor and accelerate restoration to soft shore or natural shorelines. Tina's work has a particular alignment with the regulatory strategy within the implementation strategy, and I'll talk about that very quickly. For the regulatory strategy, we know existing shoreline regulations are designed to protect species and ecosystems while also protecting private property, public safety, and public access. However, hurdles for armor removal are often high, and regulatory agencies may face challenges implementing and enforcing existing regulations for new or replacement armor. This strategy identifies how to improve implementation, compliance, and enforcement effectiveness within and across regulatory agencies to reduce new and illegal armor, reduce the impacts of repairs and replacements, and encourage armor removal. The strategy also identifies improved communication among regulatory agencies and with the public to achieve efficiencies and improve outcomes. I will say there's been a lot of great work to date across sectors, I think in a large part due to the efforts of many folks on the webinar today, but there's really a long road ahead to deal with the legacy of armor in Puget Sound. Tina's project conducted boat-based surveys of over 400 miles of marine shoreline in the San Juans to map new armor, and then complemented this research with review of relevant regulatory information. I think everyone on the call will be really excited to hear about the methodology they used in their research. This work also may identify some challenges in the regulatory space related to on-the-ground conditions for illegal and under permitted armor. The HSIL really supports these conversations to help us gain perspective among the many views out there to help operationalize the implementation strategy and inform regional technical assistance needs and opportunities. Even though the funded portion of Tina's project is coming to a close, we are very interested in a discussion today, or in the discussion today, and really continuing the conversation. One more quick note before we get to our speaker. You can get more information about our team and our program on our newly refreshed webpage. I'll drop a link in the chat shortly, and you can sign up to stay up to date. I really look forward to the discussion today. I've shared my my email here. I'll also put it in the chat if folks want to reach out. And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Tina Whitman. Tina, I'll stop sharing now if you want to get ready to share your slides.
Great, thanks, Matt. And thanks everybody for joining on this beautiful summer day. I am just going to share my screen here. And I think I'll just get right to the first slide. Oop. Okay. Is everyone seeing my first slide in large format?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure before I start rolling. So again, I'm Tina Whitman with Friends of the San Juans. And I want to thank the partnership and the strategic initiative leads and the National Estuary Program for the funding for this project, and also all the folks that were involved. And I do just want to start off today. This is a really big project. It started in 2019, and I'm going to share a lot of information. We do have a detailed final report that is done. And so I'm happy to share that. If folks want to email me, it'll also eventually end up on the website that Matt just talked about, and also on the Friends website. And also the Armor GIS data is actually on the beach strategies available there as well. So today's really, I think the intent is really to sort of hit the high notes of what our project was and some of our key findings. And I really, again, as Matt alluded to, really look forward to sort of the next steps of this and how we use some of this data driven management implications to affect positive change. And with that, I will get started. So again, we worked on a shoreline change analysis, so field-based armor mapping, a change analysis, and a regulatory review component. And there was a large team of people. So my whole team here at Friends of the San Juans. We also had boat support from the Natural Resources Department at Samish. We've got 2 amazing GIS analysts and also did our field survey. And Jim was also involved in the 2009 survey. We had a really great graduate student policy intern, Madeline Feaster, who helped with the regulatory review. And then a whole crew of folks, you'll recognize these names, right, from experts in our region on shorelines and armoring that helped as we developed the project's methods and also reviewing our final report and projects. And also, of course, thanks to our local San Juan County local integrating organization, who are the ones who originally identified this project and supported it for funding. And again, it's been funded through the National Estuary Program by the partnership and managed with our Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife partners. So I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think it's really important to always sort of think about this part, right, of why we do all this work. Why did I just spend 4 years doing this project that we were all working on? And we're learning more about that, right? And we have learned more about that. But we do know, again, that armoring does cause, impacts to coastal processes, to habitat, to species, and really relating back to our marine food webs here at the San Juans. We spent a lot of time thinking about kind of healthy shorelines and how that's impacting our marine food webs for our salmon, for our orca, and for our human communities, right? So armored shorelines also have less resilience to sea level rise. So getting into the project itself, there are sort of 3 main components. So in 2019, we did a boat-based shoreline armor survey using the Puget Sound Partnership 2018 Coastal Geologic Service methods. We also then, once that was completed, conducted a change analysis. We had done a previous boat-based inventory of all shoreline modifications back in 2009. That was supported by our Salmon Recovery Funding Board. And so that gave us this great opportunity. We had a baseline from 2009, but we actually had an armor layer, right, of what was on the ground conditions for armor. And that gave us the opportunity to do this change analysis. And then, of course, as we do this change analysis, we have this section of sites of new armor, right? Places where there's new armor. And unlike the first survey in 2009, where we had no idea if the armor we found had been put in 1932, 92, 2009, and this window, right, because we have sort of a time capsule here of that 10 years, we were able to look at all the armor that was new in that 10-year period, and then actually do, records requests and a detailed permit regulatory analysis for those. And I'll talk about more of the methods and more of the results for all of these phases as we go through the presentation. Another key component is engaging with managers, right? So we've had sessions with Department of Ecology, with Fish and Wildlife, with San Juan County, and those will continue sort of in a less presentation mode, but more of sharing of the information and thinking about next steps for implementation. And then of course, there's sort of the nuts and bolts stage of reports. There's a geodatabase with this. Obviously, we're doing this webinar right now. Again, I'm happy to be, this is a topic that's sort of near and dear to my heart. And so please feel free to contact me with any questions on or follow up after the presentation. So moving into the armor mapping methods. So again, these are kind of the standard boat-based. You're in a small boat, getting close to shore as you can. Mapping, so this time we just mapped all shoreline armor. Minimum length was 20 feet. And we collected sort of your standard suite of information on, condition, material, tidal elevation, location, and length. And again, we have this 2009 methods, which were obviously done before the partnership, worked with Coastal Geologic Service to actually develop kind of a standardized method, but we were modeling our work on other work that had been done in King County and Bainbridge and other folks, and it's very comparable. Slight differences are sort of now these tidal elevation range bins, which are much easier to identify in the field. And we also used a range finder, which helped us for a little more accurate field assessment. And just like the first time around, so there's this field component, and then there's also desktop review of all the results. So, and we were able to then compare also with our 2009 mapping results. So that gave us another layer of information. And then the quality of photos these days with vertical and oblique aerials is getting better and better. So those were also an important tool. Again, this is just sort of showing that small boat out mapping. We have a lot of miles of shoreline in the San Juan. They're very dispersed on a lot of different islands, lots of vegetation. So you do have to get sort of fairly close to see the armor. In the field, we had sort of a field data collection, also an electronic version that was being collected. And folks were sort of trained and talking on the boat so that we didn't have sort of different people filling in things differently, that sort of thing on condition and things that are a little more objective or subjective, sorry. And then so we had our sort of our hard copy and our electronic field copy. And then at the end of the day, all that electronic data would be entered in. And then again, after this field component, there's a big sort of, entering all the data into the geodatabase phase of the project. Again, where's the armor, tidal elevation, material, condition, association, some of the basic standard criteria are what we collected. And then for each of these projects or each of these phases, as I go through, I'm going to do sort of methods and results just so we sort of keep it together. And again, all of this data is in the report. So I will highlight, and for most of you, right, it doesn't really matter whether it's 27% on San Juan Island or 30% on Lopez, but just I'll hit sort of the high notes of each of these slides. So here in the San Juans, and it's to be expected, right, most of the armor is on sort of our more populated ferry service islands. You see a little more on some of the islands that have less bedrock, like Lopez, and our outer islands, which typically have less intense development, did have a much smaller amount of the armor. But we have a fair amount of armor here, just under 27 miles and about 1,000 discrete segments. We're thinking about what material it is, and this comes into play. We also do restoration projects. We run the Shore Friendly program with Northwest Straits Foundation here in San Juan County. And so this kind of information is helpful as we're thinking about triggers for, how do we interact with landowners if they're going to upgrade, or what are some of the materials and kinds of structures, right, that are more damaging to habitat, such as the vertical concrete or the creosote wood. So in the San Juans, most of our armoring is rock, and most of it is a mix of kind of large, medium, and small rock. We do have some of the kind of traditional vertical wall concrete. There is a lot of the sort of wood structures, some which I think people are just doing themselves, right? You know, tying down or otherwise securing logs that maybe have come in, and very little on the creosote wood, which is great. I should note too, some of these, the percentages obviously come up higher than 100. That's because we're associating, so same thing with material. If something is concrete and wood, then we, you know, that got checked for concrete and wood. Same thing here. So most of the armoring is bulkheads. Most of it is associated with residential development. By length, a little over 20% is associated with low-lying shoreline roads, a mix of public and private. And you can see sort of the standard suite of things, right, that it's associated with houses, beach access, docks, but again, primarily residential development. We also looking at the tidal elevation. So this is the toe of the structure. And again, this is the 2019 mapping results. So this is all the armor in San Juan County, not just the new armor. I should have said that for the beginning, but this first phase of this is just sort of what's out there on the ground, right? The reality check of what we have. And you can see most of our armor is, you know, below ordinary high water. And it's relatively higher on the beach. So there's a lot in that, about half is in that mean higher high water to ordinary high water category. But we do have a fair amount that actually is lower than that. It's a little different than some places, you know, like Whidbey, where there was a lot of development like of land out with bulkheads. That hasn't happened as much here in the San Juans, but we still do see a preponderance of the armor being located below ordinary high water. And most of the armor is in good condition. And so that's sort of defined in the protocols as functioning as intended, right? It's not, the rocks are actually, if it's a rock bulkhead, they're, you know, all up against the bank still, they're not halfway scattered down, there's not big gaps in them, all those sorts of things. And we did one sort of diversion from the protocol as we added this sort of low quality methods or materials, but not failing, because there seems to be a fair number of those out here in the San Juans where, you know, an engineer would call it a poor structure, but it is actually functioning as intended. And this is sort of, again, more in that maybe people did it themselves category of gabion baskets or pinned logs or tied logs or those sorts of things. Again, as a, you know, other parts of our work, we interact with shoreline property owners quite heavily and thinking about reducing demand for armor and helping people come up with alternatives. And so that level of distinction for us is important because it is, you know, it's less investment, right? It's not the brand new $100,000 bulkhead that is going to be less likely to move. But this is one that maybe will be more amenable or more possible to potentially get out or redesign. But again, overall, most of it is functioning. And then just looking at the distribution on our shore forms. So of course, the more highly erosive places like feeder bluffs have a significantly more of the armor. We also see a large amount of armor on our pocket beaches. And you can see, so we've got 22% of the feeder bluffs in San Juan County are already armored as of 2019. Same thing with 17% for barrier beaches and pocket beaches. And then this bedrock shores, there's only a little bit. We actually do have a little bit of armor on bedrock shores. People have sort of put it in to either like build a little land area behind or for a hot tub. And then a very small proportion of that is also really, really small pocket beaches. So it actually is a sand and gravel beach, but it's mapped as bedrock shore because our pocket beach mapping picks up at a 50-foot linear width of the beach. So the really teeny pocket beaches are mapped as bedrock shores in the San Juans. But again, we see most of it happening, of course, in the soft shore environment and especially on feeder bluffs. Okay, so switching gears to the change analysis. So the mapping is done. We have our 2009 old mapping layer as a baseline, and then we have the new 2019 mapping layer with photos, you know, and all the associated data that we collect. So we were able to compare that 2009 with the 2019, compare all the field data, and then also do a really detailed, and we had multiple staff actually do this phase of doing the oblique and vertical air photo review to really determine whether something was new, existing, or removed. And then for a small subset, sometimes the vertical air photos just happen to not get a good angle at your site, right? Or there's shade or glare or something like that. And we did do a small amount of follow-up boat surveys just to make sure that we felt, you know, that we could really confirm whether something was moved or not. And I will say that in this geodatabase, we have sort of the relevant vertical and oblique air photos that were used in this decision making of sort of is something mapping as something as new versus something that maybe we missed in 2009. Those are all tagged in the geodatabase, so we have all that in the record. And then the result of this change analysis, right, is that now we are able to, unlike when we did this baseline, we were able to actually say, okay, how much armor was there in 2009 and is still there, right? So that's what we called existing armor. How much is new armor, which means that it was there in 2019, but it was not mapped in 2009, or how much armor has been removed between that time period, that decade of 2009 to 2019. And just a clarification here, because this will be important as we move forward, because this batch of new armor is what we take through the regulatory review process. New armor is new linear extent of armor. So it is more shoreline covered with armor. This project with a scale of 400 miles and 1,000 segments of armor did not look at, did it get bigger? Did a log turn into a riprap bulkhead? Did it get lower on the beach? Did it get higher on the beach? So we are not looking at changes in the specific armor. We're looking at actually new linear extent of armor, new segments of armor, or segments that got, you know, longer. So I just want to be clear on that. We were not able to and did not have in our scope sort of that how much did the existing armor change. The data is there, those two photos are there. Someone could probably go look at them all and do that, but that would be a big push. So that was not part of this effort. We really just looked at where is their new shoreline armoring? And then again, also where it's removed. So for our countywide, we've got just over 100 segments of new armor in that decade for a little under 2 miles. We've got about 25 miles of existing armor. And then we have 0.3 miles of armor that has been removed. And then for a total, you know, amount again of roughly 1,000 segments and roughly 27 miles of armor. So if you just look at that in another way and look at sort of armor out versus armor in that decade, you can see that the new armor installed is clearly outpacing the armor removed. And this is sort of the place where I make my plug that I know, and people have heard me make this plug a lot of times, but we use on the armor indicator, right? We use the HPA records to track changes in how we're doing on the armor in, armor out. And I think as we get further along in this regulatory review, and these results on the slide really clearly show, right, that if we just use the permit record, we're missing what's happening on the ground. Because here in the San Juans, and this is happening in other places where they've done these compliance studies as well, is that we really are still seeing more going in than we are seeing removed. Again, another way to show the data. So yellow is all the existing armor in San Juan County. The red dots are where new armor happened in that past decade. And then the blue are the armor removed. And then one note on the armor removed, about 1/3 of these are actual restoration, you know, permitted restoration projects. Most of them, you know, came right through our shop. A handful are places where there was large wood that was maybe tied down or like sort of hidden somehow by the landowner. That wood has since washed away. a bunch of those are places where we've done, shore friendly site visits with property owners. And it's just really clear from the photos, right, that that wood is just no longer there. And then there's a small subset that actually had fairly significant amounts of rock that are gone. And that this was not part of the regulatory review. And it's sort of on my check in next and sort of see what happened with that. Because that means that that's folks taking out armor themselves, right? That it wasn't actually part of a planned restoration project. So I'd be curious to just learn more about that and see what's motivating those people and be curious how they did the work as well. But again, the armor removed was not part of our regulatory review moving forward. We really focused on this. Where is there a new linear extent of armor? And you can see just from the patterns here too. So if you're that familiar with the San Juans, these maps where all these dots are really looks like the soft shore part of our islands versus the bedrock, and also really looks a lot like where we've got sort of our more heavily developed patterns, some of our smaller parcels. So there's not any really huge surprises in this distribution, except for that's a lot of new armor in the last decade. So again, switching gears, looking now turning to the regulatory review. So we mapped all the armor in 2019, did a change analysis of that decade, 2009 to 2019. And then we've got this pot, right, of just under 2 miles or 1.8, 6 miles of new armor. And that's at about 108 sites, or is at 108 sites. So this next step is where we took those 108 sites and went and brought those through the regulatory review. And we really had two key questions, right? Did they have permits? So that's what we call kind of our compliance side of this. And then for those that did have permits, let's look at those and see can we learn anything about how's the permit process going? Is there anything that we can glean from that might help us as managers, right, be more effective? Because we can sort of throw up our hand and say, oh, the permit process is too complicated, or it's not working, or it's not effective. But if we can really drill down and sort of start looking at here's some trends that we're finding, it can help us really focus our management response at the places where we can maybe be most effective and make change. So again, we're kind of in this compliance. Did you have a permit? And if you had a permit, what that process looked like? Sort of two tracks here for the world of the new permits. And then this was a part that with COVID that became really challenging. I know many of you at WFW weren't at your office for a very long time, and we weren't allowed to go to anyone's office. And so the whole process of sort of researching permits and doing formal public records requests and going back and forth took over a year to get all the information for these 108 sites. And COVID certainly slowed that down, but it is a good reminder that sort of how we're structuring our tracking and all those sorts of things. Hopefully we can get it in the future to have it be in a way that is faster and more easily accessible for all of us, right? Because it did take a huge amount of time and a big lift to get this data. And we sort of showed this list of all the ways that we got that data. And the reason I do that is I just want you to know that we were really thorough. And I'm pretty confident that we didn't miss anything, right? That there's not a permit. So, we looked at the existing online databases. We did formal public records requests for everything for those parcels, whether it was for an armor permit. We looked at their dock permits to see if maybe there was a little section of armor snuck into that permit, right? We had older copies of the county's own permit database where we cross-checked by bulkhead, by project type, by last landowner last name, by the date windows, by the parcel numbers. We looked at hearings examiner and Shoreline's hearings board decisions. The county would come back and say, nope, no permits for that parcel. And we'd say, well, we have 5 comment letters on the SEPA. Can you check with this number? And then they'd be able to find it, right? So this was a long and iterative process. And I think it is unlikely, maybe some things slipped by, but it is certainly unlikely that a lot slipped through because we really were very careful at trying to make sure that we're getting all the information that does exist out there. A couple other things before I get into the results of this regulatory review, thinking about the methods. So town of Friday Harbor is the only incorporated town in San Juan County. We did have 2 sites that had local shoreline permits that were issued by the town, not the county. We did use those in the compliance results, so those show up as having a local shoreline permit, but we did not do a detailed regulatory review because it felt like 2 is just not really a good number to really say much about how that was working for them. The other big one, I keep getting asked is how come you didn't look at, the Army Corps of Engineers and the federal permit? And the answer is twofold. One is that in that time frame, 2009 to 2019, they were very strictly keeping their jurisdiction for thinking about and being engaged in shoreline permits at mean high or high water. So it meant they were involved in virtually none, a few enforcement. And then also it is really challenging to get data from them because they don't track by parcel number or landowner last name or project type. So sort of for that combo of reasons, this is very focused on state hydraulic permits and San Juan County shoreline permits. And again, I talked about this already. We did not include the armor removals in this regulatory review. There are a handful that I don't know if they have permits or not for the landowner to get a permit to remove armor on there. We track those sorts of things at Friends, and I haven't seen those come through the permit process. So that's sort of in a different bucket of look at later. So again, regulatory review is looking at those 108 permits, or those 108 sites, sorry, that had new armor. So of those 108 sites that had new armor, and in that year of doing research to try to find all the permit results, we ended up with 23 San Juan County shoreline permits, 2 town of Friday Harbor shoreline permits, and 20 WWW HPAs. And then again, this next step, as I'll transition to results of the regulatory review, we did that detailed review of all the permit materials for those 23 county permits and the 20 HPAs. So first results are our compliance results. So the blue pie, a section of the pie, the smallest piece of pie, is those places that had state and local permits before the bulkhead was installed. The green, next larger piece of the pie, are places that had either one of those permits, or they could have had both, but they didn't get both until after the fact, after it was already installed. And then the red, the very large section of the pie, 74% of these sites, there were no state or county shoreline permits or town shoreline permits, because we did include town in these compliance results. That was this is sort of the big aha for this project. I knew it was going to be not a pretty picture. I didn't think that the red pie would be quite so big as it is. But it does really show, right, that a very large amount of armoring, 3/4 of it is happening totally outside of the radar of the regulatory system upfront or enforcement, which means there's no cultural resources surveys happening. There's no mitigation happening, no permit conditions happening, no design and influence, sort of all these structures that we've built to really influence how projects happen and manage outcomes just aren't happening at all, right? Because it's happening completely under the radar. So again, this is just another way to share those same results. So we just had 10 of those 108 new structures were fully permitted before they were installed. Again, the vast majority had no permits and had never been picked up in any sort of enforcement action. And then we've got that smaller number, 17% were sort of somewhere in between, either had one of the 2 permits or were permitted after being installed. Okay, so that's the compliance part. That's the sort of, did you get a permit or not? So the next piece of this, for the places that did have permits, so for those 23 county sites and those 20 HPAs, we did sort of the deep dive, and by we, I mean Maddie, with my assistance and guidance. But were there forage fish surveys? What reports were included in there? What information was in those reports? Was there an inspection? Was there any evidence of a site visit? Was there evidence of interagency coordination? Are there scaled designs? Where was ordinary high water put on the map? Below mean high or high water, where it probably not located or accurate? So we try to really do sort of a, what are all the things, and we have this like crazy insane spreadsheet, all the things that you want to know, because while you're sitting there looking at that stack of permit information, and it's actually mostly electronic these days, so not stacks, but let's look at it, right, and collect every bit of information that we might think we might want, so that we can maybe say something about how this process is going. And this is where I need to add the caveat before I do the results. We did not go out and do inspections. So some of the compliance work that's been funded by NEP, you know, WWW has actually gone back out and stood on the ground and did people build their permit, you know, according to their permit. We do not have that kind of compliance information. That compliance information I shared was, did they have a permit for armor at that site? Not did they implement it according to the permit. So I just want to be clear that we did not do that in this. We are looking at the material and the permit record. The other caveat, right, is that we're looking at the material in the permit record. And so there might be something that happened that isn't in the permit record. And so then we're not able to talk about it, right? And again, we went back and forth. So we'd say, okay, you got a permit and you sent us 3 documents, but we didn't see the habitat report. Is there a habitat report? And then we would, you know, the county would go back and look, and often we would find, you know, we did do our due diligence to sort of get what we can. But again, maybe there was a site inspection and there's just no record of it in the file. So this is regulatory review based on the permit record. So I'm just going to run through some of these results. So switching between San Juan County and WWW. So most of the permits are coming through at the county level as exemptions. About 1/3 of the permitted armor were after the fact permits. A subset of those, that armor was slated to be removed of the after the fact. As of now, as of May, when I last checked with the county planners and the code enforcement, none of that armor that is slated to be removed has yet been removed. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons why when we get to management implications. But again, just a small portion of that was in the enforcement bucket. And then for WWW, the vast majority standard HPA, a little bit of after the fact, and then just some of these other numbers, right, are just looking at, okay, well, there's some state HPAs where there wasn't a local permit. Again, that starts to just lend us to thinking, you know, my mind at least starts jumping right to solutions, right? Like, can we have a better like connection between these 2 permits so that they actually have to sort of, you know, be dependent on each other? They're supposed to, right? But that's just evidence that that's one of the places that might be sort of an easy fix. So thinking about kind of what we found overall, and this applies to state and San Juan County. So we saw really limited evidence of any site inspections or interagency coordination, and virtually all of it was linked to after the fact and violation situations. So in many of the violation situations, we were seeing interagency coordination and we were seeing site inspections. But for the sort of regular going through the permit process ahead of time, we weren't seeing that. We saw limited instances where mitigation was required, virtually none in the county, some in WWW, and there was no evidence of mitigation being implemented or being successful. Again, that's just, there's no evidence in the record, right? It doesn't mean that that person didn't implement it and that it's doing great, but we don't have any record of that. And I just talked about that. Some authorized armor is going to be removed, hasn't happened yet. And then just some of the other interesting trends, right? And I'm not surprised because I look at these permit applications all the time, but lo and behold, officially, like none of the consultant habitat reports concluded anything except no impact, no net loss, right? So that's just sort of one of the key findings. It's sort of a check the box, you have a habitat report, and they all seem to just check the box that says no net loss. Again, thinking about what was in the permit record, and have to do the caveat here, right? WDFW doesn't require all of these things. And so, but they are things that are helpful in deciding, right, what are the impacts of the project? Should mitigation be required? What's the need for the structure? So I think they do inform whether you're sort of giving, you know, a grade of, oh, are you implementing this properly? It's more of a, are there trends here of not very many places are getting site visits, only associated with violations. You know, we get that that's a capacity issue, but if it's something that's really important, right, then we can work on the capacity part of it. And also just seeing really low interagency coordination. That's something I was involved in the San Juan initiative that did a permit review 15 years ago. One of the big outcomes, right, was we need better interagency coordination and more site inspections to have better outcomes for landowners too, right, to make it less confusing for them and have better outcomes for habitat. Both of those things seem to be happening at a really low level still. Again, looking at lots of conditions in WDFW permit projects, very little in the inspection side of things or sort of the reporting back, whether it's photos or inspections. And then not so much information in the record. Again, maybe it all happened and it's just not in the record. But that will be something I think if we're sort of tightening up, they have that great apps website, like let's make sure the mitigation plans are on there. Let's make sure post-project photos get put on there. I know people are supposed to submit them. I submit them when we do restoration projects. So that extra step of can we get those actually out there so we can start tracking the impacts of some of these things. Again, I see I'm taking a lot of time. I'm going to move a little faster through these. This is the same kind of findings. This is all in the report. I guess I just want to really note that nobody found net loss or habitat impact in any of the habitat results. We see very little actually with sort of demonstrating an erosion rate or a threat to a primary structure. We actually see very little with to scale drawings. So that's a concern. Again, with the county, a little bit of only minimally mitigation required, minimally site visits. Most of those site visits, again, there was only 3 site visits and 2 of them were after the fact with a violation. No evidence of post-project inspection, and all the interagency coordination is with violations. And then so sort of circling all the way back to where I was in the beginning, right, of like, why do we care about this and what does it matter? When we start looking at some of those places that we care about for juvenile salmon, for forage fish, for our food web, for our functioning soft shores, we still see new armor going in on pocket beaches, on feeder bluffs, and on our documented forage fish spawning beaches. And again, none of those reports found any net loss, right, or any impact. So that's, you can sort of start looking at these and just thinking about how are we doing. And that, like that forage fish spawning site in feeder bluff that's 62 feet, like that's the same segment of armor, right? It just happens to be on both. And less, you know, there's more without a permit, less going in with a permit, but still happening on those priority sites. So the elevation, again, this is looking at the new armor. We see less new armor going in really low. That's really good. Not so great. We still see the vast majority of armor is going in below ordinary high water. So thinking about what this all means, and I'm going to try to, we're getting close to the end here to wrap, because I do want to be able to get to a little bit of discussion, because I know we have a lot of people who have tons of experience and insight on this topic on the call. But so for us, right, this aha, like if we're only looking at the permit record to tell us what's going on, we are not getting an accurate assessment at all of what's going on, right? So we need monitoring of on the ground conditions, whether that's every 10 years, every 5 years, people going out to try to catch stuff happening. Somehow we got to think about how do we do a better job of understanding what's really happening, and how do we sweep all those people that aren't involved in the permit process, either from the enforcement or the regulatory side. How do we get them into the fold And there's a lot of different ways to do that, right? Regulatory and non-regulatory, but how do we get them into the system so that we can protect cultural resources, protect environmental resources, have the permit process work as intended? And I think the most important thing, right, is this lack of compliance. Not only is it limiting the effectiveness of regulatory programs, right? If you only have a small subset of permits that even are coming through and getting sort of the benefit of the new regulations, it's also limiting shore-friendly restoration programs. All that other effort is sort of dependent on, you know, protection projects holding the line. Otherwise, we're not getting to net gain, right? We're just sort of still treading water and still slowly losing. And then regulatory effectiveness for those places that really are, that actually are, so it's less, right? But some are still coming through the permit process. It's got to be easier to get the information. We've got to be coordinating better with agencies and also taking a look to see what's really happening out on the ground, and tracking what's happening with mitigation, and also thinking about how do we help our regulators, how do we give people the resources they need to be able to critically review these applications. So if we're, you know, approving permits where there's no demonstration of need, and, you know, even if it's at a forage fish spawning site and at a feeder bluff, there's no acknowledgement of net loss. You know, we've got to think about how do we sort of increase our standards on that to do a better job for shorelines. The other piece I think is really important, it was a little depressing when I started doing this, is looking at all the other great work that's been funded mostly through NEP actually, but is happening like WWW, San Juan Initiative, the TACT project that I think was Mason and Kitsap in San Juan County, the work in Hood Canal, the recent work that the LIO, Puget Sound Partnership coordinators are doing with the Evans School in Cascadia, looking at sort of the what's happening, how are regulatory systems working on shorelines. You know, there's a lot of commonality here, and I think, you know, at a certain point we just have to move from these studies and get to the implementing of recommendations. And there's some key ones, right? Approved monitoring enforcement. Is unpermitted development happening? Yes. Are we achieving no net loss? Unlikely. So again, I think the body of research is really here. It's not just San Juan County. This is happening, you know, sound-wide at various levels, right? But there is really this very large body of work that very consistently comes up with the same recommendations. And again, I really am excited to work with folks on implementing some of those, kind of get into the next phase. And this is my second to last slide, so I can stop talking and start listening. But again, some of these key pieces, like how do we make the time and space and resources for agencies to coordinate better? How are we going to track better on the ground conditions and link that with enforcement? And how do we just improve the permit process, right? So that for folks that are going through the process, that we're having really good outcomes for shorelines. I have people tell me, you know, oh, the permit process is so onerous that they assume it just must be like doing such great things for the environment, right? But then we're still seeing all these structures that are built pretty low on the beach and at a feeder bluff and at a forage fish site and no proof of mitigation. And so if it's going to be really hard and time consuming, like let's make sure that it's actually also being effective. And then, of course, you know, this isn't just a regulatory solution, right? That is not going to solve all this. We're going to need education, regulators, landowners, contractors, the general public, you know, more support for this. And again, I think sort of the mantra here is that unless we really double down, right? Like everyone wants to talk about restoration. It's so exciting. We have so many projects for it. There are so many funding streams. But unless we get this protection thing, at least better, not even all the way right, but better, that restoration, and I do restoration, right? I do restoration, I do shoreline, shore friendly. I am all in on those, but unless we also do this protection piece, we are just giving ourselves long-term job security. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you, everybody. And again, I know that's like this huge dump of information, and it is all in the report, and I am happy to follow up with folks afterwards. So thanks so much for your time.
Great. Thanks, Tina. That was super informative. We have about 8 minutes or so for questions. A bunch of questions have come in on the chat, and if you're, we won't get to all of them, but If folks do continue to send me questions in the chat, Tina, if you're amenable, maybe I can share them all with you and you could do a follow-up too.
Sure.
If folks do want to ask a question live, if they could raise their hand, Elizabeth or I can call on you, and you can cut out the middleman if you want. There was one, I'll ask one quick question if folks are going to raise their hand, which is from George Kaminsky. Is the permit analysis info captured in the geodatabase? Maybe that's an easy one.
Yes, it is. With the caveat of not in the version that is in the beach strategies at this time. So they have the 2009 armor mapping layer that just has more tidal elevation, condition, those sorts of things. But yes, we do have all this data is in the geodatabase, and I'm happy to share it. So just contact me.
Great.
We have a question from Jason.
Great. Go ahead, Jason.
Hi, I'll try to turn my camera on. So hi, I'm Jason Ulbrich. I'm the new Puget Sound section manager here. And thank you, Tina, for such a great presentation and for obviously all the hard work you did putting that together and coming, all the hard work that went into putting that all together. My question, and I'm sorry if it's a little bit, I am a neophyte here, so bear with me. But in your analysis of the trends as far as permitting and enforcement, did you see any type of indicators as far as, you know, I was thinking back 2009, 2010, we were going through recession, budget cuts, lack of staff to do that. Did you see any indicators of where you know, just lack of funding due to the economic conditions of that time might have contributed to
Yeah, I don't think so. So I would say the biggest problem with the enforcement and compliance is not that the agencies, county or state, are not doing the enforcement job. It's just that it's happening totally under the radar. Those enforcement. So on those enforcement cases that did happen, some of that armor is slated to be removed, but it's sort of this small handful, right? I can put on my fingers if I can line up properly with my camera. 6 cases went through enforcement, and the other 80 are just out there and have never entered at all into the regulatory realm, whether that's enforcement or permitting. We do see a continued trend with sort of more and better information in the permit material packets as time goes by. That is definitely a noticeable trend.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Great. I can, unless there's a question, I'll jump back to the chat. Cool. There's another question here from Allison Cook. Is there a sense for any quote bad players, or I guess in the sense of bulkhead builders or landscapers that are not getting permits, or if unpermitted work is being done by homeowners themselves? I think you touched this a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one we're definitely digging into in the future as we work with the agencies and the county to think about follow-up and next steps, right? Is that there are certainly a few bad actors out there, I would say, in terms of contractors, and there's starting to be a lot more of what maybe looks like the done by yourself, but done maybe more by landscapers, and that you sort of nailed that because you put landscapers in your question. So there's certainly seems to be more of that kind of work just kind of happening under the radar. So that will be kind of part of next steps is really looking at those places that haven't had any sort of enforcement and looking at, how egregious are they, and does it look like it's some of the same people, and really trying to dig into that as we move forward with addressing those.
Right. And there was actually a follow-up question by Allison that I missed. Does local government require HBA to go into their permit record before construction?
So it's a condition of usually of the local permit that you have an HPA. And it's a condition of the HPA that you have SEPA, and there's a few cases, right, where SEPA is not required. But I don't know the answer of that if it's a condition that they actually have that permit sort of checked already.
Cool. Okay, I'll keep going. We got more questions. We'll do a couple more. From Angela Adams, why aren't permits being sought? Is it more of a lack of understanding or avoidance due to burden concern about not being approved? And then it goes on, I wonder where in Puget Sound this permit process enforcement is working.
Yeah, so good questions. I mean, so from some of that other regional work, it does look like that there are trends of unpermitted structures are going in and structures are going in not meeting sort of the conditions of the permit, right? So bigger or lower on the beach or those sorts of things. And that's been found around the Sound. I think it's a suite of things. I think, for some, it's fear of the permit process. For a small few, it's maybe that they don't know. Obviously, when it's a professional contractor, they do know. I think the biggest part, especially in San Juan County, is that there's no repercussion, right? Like you don't get caught. And if you do get caught, so 8 of 86, right, entered in that 10 years, entered the enforcement. So your odds are really good that you just get to keep it. And even if you do get caught, and the way enforcement happens here is you just get shunted into the after the fact permit process, which often results in, actually authorizing the structure. And that also itself takes years. So then the longer it's been in, right? So there is not a lot of disincentive, I would say. And unfortunately, over time, we've been loosening, like at our county level, we've been sort of loosening the disincentives, like making the fines less and those sorts of things. So maybe a lack of political will, and also we're not tracking, right? So we're just not finding them.
Okay. Okay. Let me see. I think we got time now, at least another question from Amy Kenny. Any indication of why some unpermitted armor was slated for removal? Were they particularly egregious structures or impacts to spawning beaches, feeder bluffs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple of the ones that are slated for removal, and there were a couple of notable things about them. One was that there was federal, state, and county involvement in the enforcement action. And then a couple of these are right next to each other. And yes, they are on a documented spawning beach and were put in quite low on the beach, and also installed, I think, in the 20, or at least caught in the 2018, 2019 timing. So I think all of those things sort of worked together to mean that those are coming out. So it's more recent, right, where things are sort of tightening up. You've got the multiple agencies involved. It is a documented forage fish spawning beach, and it was like concrete and vertical treated wood, and they were very low on the beach. So those did sort of all go together. And again, just so few are even getting into the enforcement system, right? So there's only 6 in there, and 3 are slated for full or partial removal. So like if once they're getting into that system, at least for that very small amount, they're working a little bit, right? But we just got to figure out how do we actually either get more people into the permits up front, or also get more compliance happening, compliance enforcement engagement.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Tina. I think we're right about time. I think it's time for just a quick wrap up. I just want to, of course, thank you for the presentation and all the hard work. And it's so informative, and I know a lot goes in it. If folks do have more questions for Tina, if they don't have her contact information, I can surely get it to you. There were some questions in the chat that we didn't have time, and I'll be sure to share that with Tina so we can get some comments and feedback back. And the resource, this webinar has been recorded, so we will have a recording available, and the resources from the project will also be available eventually on our website. So with that, I want to also thank Elizabeth for the technical support and hope everybody has a great rest of the day. Tina, any final thought?
No, I just wanted to reiterate, thanks everybody for your time. And I do really look forward to working on next steps. And please feel free to just reach out to me directly. I'm happy to share the report and, you know, any data from the geodatabase as well.
Great.
So thanks, Matt and Elizabeth, for hosting.
Thank you.